Hey there, everyone. Today's story will in all probability sit well with fathers and mothers that know the kind of love one has for a daughter and that blinding need to protect them at all cost. You will see how this ex-Navy SEAL took matters into his own hands when the police failed to do what they were supposed to do. This thug really messed with the wrong girl. This story is based on real events that transpired in August and September of 1999 in Marietta, just outside Atlanta, Georgia. Let's get into it. Ethan Cole sat at the kitchen table, basking in the soft light of a peaceful morning. Retirement from the Navy SEALs hadn't been easy. For years he had thrived on adrenaline, waking up each day not knowing whether it would be his last. The danger had been a part of him. But when his wife, Rachel, passed away 3 years ago, leaving him to raise their daughter, Lila, on his own, he knew he had to leave that life behind. Lila was all he had now. At 16, she was the mirror of her mother, strong-willed, intelligent, with a kindness that made her father both proud and protective. The decision to settle in their suburban home had been for Lila's sake. She had friends, a school she loved, and a community that felt safe. Ethan, however, always felt slightly out of place. His training made it difficult to fully relax, even in the calmest settings. He kept up his fitness, not out of habit, but because the thought of being unprepared haunted him. In the back of his mind, he always thought something might go wrong. This particular morning seemed no different from any other. Lila was at school already, and was going to spend time with friends that afternoon after school, a welcome distraction from the challenges of teenage life. Ethan trusted her. She was sensible and capable, and he didn't want to smother her with overprotection. The day went by like any other, but as the afternoon wore on, Ethan started to grow restless for some odd reason. He checked his phone every few minutes, waiting for his daughter's usual heading home text, but it never came. Hours passed, and Ethan's nerves began to fray. When Lila finally returned, it was long after dark. Her footsteps were heavy, her breathing labored. Ethan noticed immediately that something was wrong. She stood in the doorway, looking smaller than he had ever seen her, her body trembling as she clutched her phone tightly to her chest. "Lila?" His voice was calm, though his heart pounded with fear. "What happened?" She didn't answer at first, her eyes distant. When she did speak, it was barely a whisper. "Dad, I didn't want to go with them, but..." Reggie wouldn't stop. The name hit Ethan like a sledgehammer. Reggie Miller. Ethan had heard about the 26-year-old gang leader from the neighborhood kids. A predator in every sense, Reggie was known for preying on young girls, using charm and intimidation to get what he wanted. He ran with a local gang that dealt drugs and committed petty crimes, but his true nature was far darker. Word had spread of his violent tendencies, but he had always managed to avoid serious consequences, thanks to his influence and fear tactics. What did he do? Ethan's voice shook with a mix of anger and dread. Lila collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "He hurt me, Dad. He hurt me." Ethan's world shattered. Every fiber of his being wanted to protect his daughter, but he hadn't been there when she needed him the most. He held her tightly, whispering words of comfort even as rage consumed him. Lila had been violated, and the law was not going to be enough to make this right. When Lila finally fell asleep after hours of consoling, Ethan stayed up, staring at the ceiling. Memories of his SEAL days flooded back. How he had taken down enemies of the state. How he had operated in the shadows, eliminating threats before they could strike. But this wasn't some far-off battlefield. This was home, and the enemy had attacked his daughter. Deep down, Ethan knew what had to be done. Reggie Miller had made a grave mistake, and he would make sure this scumbag paid for it. As the clock ticked into the early hours, Ethan made a decision. He was going to take matters into his own hands. He would find Reggie, and this time, justice would be swift and unforgiving. Despite Ethan's resolve to dish out punishment himself, he and Lila did go to the police station the next morning to lay a charge of assault against Reggie Miller. Lila did most of the talking, with Ethan catching himself in the midst of a far-off stare a number of times. At that point, he knew he had to trust that the police would deal with the matter adequately, but it was hard to stand back. The next couple of days were a blur of police interviews, emotional breakdowns, and sleepless nights. The authorities had been sympathetic, but their hands were tied. Reggie Miller was known to them, but they lacked the evidence to bring him in. The officers warned Ethan that cases like these took time. They would investigate, they promised. But Ethan knew the truth. Reggie had connections, and the system was slow. Lila withdrew into herself, her once bright spirit dimmed by the trauma. She stayed home from school, refusing to leave the house. Each time Ethan tried to comfort her, he felt helpless. No amount of fatherly love could erase the pain she had suffered. Then, one evening, Ethan sat in his garage, staring at a box he had kept sealed ever since he retired from active duty. The box held relics of his past life, his K-bar knife, his old SEAL vest, and the gear that had seen him through countless missions. He hadn't touched it since his retirement, not wanting to relive those memories. But now, the call of his old life was too strong to ignore. Opening the box, Ethan ran his fingers over the blade of the knife, remembering the precision it had required to survive those covert missions. He'd been trained to eliminate threats before they could strike, to protect the innocent at all costs. That part of him had never left, even if he had tried to bury it. The police wouldn't bring justice, but Ethan could. He began to formulate a plan in his mind, one built on his years of military experience. He would need to gather intel, locate Reggie, and take him down before he could hurt anyone else, before he could hurt Lila again. Reggie may have been powerful in the streets, but he was no match for a SEAL in a dark alleyway. Ethan knew the risks. Going after Reggie could escalate into something dangerous. His training had taught him that every mission carried consequences, and this one was no different. If he failed, he could end up in jail or worse, and then Lila would be all on her own. But as he thought about his daughter's broken spirit, the risks seemed insignificant. The first step was information. Ethan spent days gathering details about Reggie's gang and their operations. He reached out to old military contacts, men who had served with him, some of whom had transitioned into law enforcement or private security. They knew the streets better than anyone, and they respected Ethan's skills. His closest contact, Tom Carter, had been a fellow SEAL and was now a detective in the city. Over a few beers one evening, Ethan laid out the situation. Tom listened carefully, his face hardening as the story unfolded. "You sure you want to go down this road, Ethan?" Tom asked, his voice heavy with concern. "Reggie's a dangerous guy, and if you make a move, it's not going to be clean. He's got eyes everywhere." "I don't care," Ethan replied, his voice cold. "He hurt my daughter, Tom. I'm not letting this slide." Tom sighed, knowing there was no changing Ethan's mind. "All right. I'll give you what I've got, but be careful. If you go after him, make sure you finish the job." Ethan nodded. He wasn't going to stop until Reggie was finished. Tom provided him with key intel on Reggie's movements, where he hung out, who he associated with, and most importantly, where he was most vulnerable. Ethan took it all in, his mind already formulating a plan. The pieces were falling into place. Ethan spent his nights reviewing the information, mapping out Reggie's routines and weaknesses. It was just like his old days in the SEALs, planning an op, ensuring every detail was accounted for. But this time, it was personal. Despite his wife's concerns echoing in his mind, Ethan was resolute. The system was in the process of failing his daughter. It was time for him to step up and deliver justice on his own terms. For days, Ethan stalked Reggie's operation, his instincts honed from years of military experience. Reggie's gang operated out of a rundown warehouse on the edge of the city, a perfect hideout for illicit activities. The building was decrepit, surrounded by overgrown weeds and graffiti-covered walls. To anyone else, it was just another forgotten relic of the city's industrial past. But to Reggie, it was the nerve center of his empire. Ethan approached the area cautiously each time, keeping a low profile. He watched from a distance, using binoculars to scope out the gang's movements. Reggie was well protected. His men were always on guard, patrolling the area in pairs, heavily armed and alert. But they weren't trained. They were thugs. Dangerous, yes, but undisciplined and uncoordinated. Ethan had dealt with much worse. Ethan spent hours observing, memorizing every detail. The shifts of the guards, the vehicles that came and went, the layout of the building. The warehouse had multiple entry points, but they were all guarded. Ethan would need to be quick, efficient, and silent if he was going to get inside unnoticed. Ultimately, Ethan's surveillance paid off. He discovered that Reggie had a routine. Every few nights, he would leave the warehouse with a small group of what was obviously his most trusted men and head to a nearby club. Ethan determined that it would be during one of these outings that Reggie would be most vulnerable. The club was flashy, filled with loud music and flashing lights, a perfect cover for an ambush. Ethan knew he had to be patient. He couldn't rush this. He spent the next few nights mapping out the club as well, learning the layout and planning his approach. He'd follow Reggie there, isolate him from his men, and confront him when the time was right. But the more Ethan watched Reggie, the angrier he became. The man moved with an arrogance that made Ethan's blood boil. Reggie was untouchable in his own mind, walking through the streets like he owned the place, surrounded by sycophants who laughed at his jokes and carried out his dirty work. He was a predator, preying on the weak, and Ethan couldn't stand the thought of him walking free. Finally, the night came. Ethan sat in his car, parked a few blocks from the club, waiting. His gear was packed. His knife, his vest, his tactical boots and dark clothes. He had left his gun behind, knowing that the mission would be up close and personal. This wasn't about a firefight. It was about sending a message. After a long wait, Reggie eventually arrived at the club, flanked by two of his men. They laughed and joked as they walked in, totally unaware of Ethan watching them from the shadows. Ethan's heart pounded, but his mind was calm, his focus razor-sharp. He followed them inside, slipping through the crowd unnoticed. The club was a chaotic mess of flashing lights and thumping bass, the perfect cover for what Ethan was about to do. He moved through the crowd like a ghost, his eyes locked on Reggie as he made his way to a VIP booth in the back. The gang leader sat down, ordering drinks, his men stationed nearby, but relaxed. They weren't expecting trouble, and that was their mistake. Ethan waited for the right moment. He watched as Reggie's men got distracted, one of them flirting with a waitress, the other engrossed in his phone. The timing was perfect. He made his move. Ethan slipped through the VIP area's velvet rope like a shadow, keeping his movements fluid and unnoticed. The heavy bass of the club's music masked the sound of his footsteps as he approached Reggie's table. His heart raced, but years of military conditioning kept his body calm and his focus sharp. Reggie sat at the back of the booth, drinking and laughing, oblivious to the danger creeping up behind him. His two men were close by, but still very much distracted. They were complacent, too confident in their leader's untouchable reputation. Ethan waited for a beat, his instincts guiding him. He had to be quick. One chance to strike before the situation turned deadly. In one smooth motion, he grabbed the first guard, twisting his arm behind his back and pressing his K-bar knife to the man's throat. The second guard barely had time to register the attack before Ethan's boot connected with his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Reggie looked up, startled. His drink fell from his hand, spilling across the table as his eyes locked onto Ethan's. "What the fuck?" Reggie started, but Ethan cut him off, pressing the knife harder against the first guard's throat. "Stay down, or I'll cut him," Ethan growled, his voice low and deadly. His eyes burned with fury, but his hand remained steady, holding the knife with the precision of years of training. Reggie's men hesitated, their bravado faltering under Ethan's cold stare. They weren't trained for this. They were thugs, not soldiers. They had no idea what they were up against. Ethan threw the first guard to the floor, his knife still ready. "Piss off, get out of here," he snarled at Reggie's men. They didn't need to be told twice. Scrambling to their feet, they bolted from the booth, leaving Reggie alone with Ethan. Now it was just the two of them. Reggie glared at Ethan, his face a mix of fear and defiance. "You don't know who you're messing with, bro," he spat, trying to regain his composure. "I own this place. I own this whole city." Ethan wasn't impressed. He stepped forward, his knife still in hand, his eyes locked on Reggie's. "You think you're untouchable?" he growled at Reggie, his voice cold. "You think you can hurt innocent people and just walk away?" Reggie sneered, but there was fear behind his bravado. "What are you gonna do? Kill me? You think that'll solve anything?" Ethan leaned in, his face inches from Reggie's. "I'm not here to kill you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the pounding music. "I'm here to make sure you never hurt anyone again." Without another word, Ethan grabbed Reggie by the collar, yanking him to his feet. The gangster struggled, but Ethan's grip was like iron. He dragged Reggie out of the booth, through the club's exit, and into the cold night air outside. Reggie's bravado crumbled as they reached the alley behind the club. "You don't have to do this, man," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean to hurt her, I swear." Ethan slammed him against the wall, silencing him. "Shut up," he hissed. "You don't get to talk about my daughter." Ethan dragged Reggie through the dark alley. The club's pounding music faded into the background as they moved deeper into the shadows, away from prying eyes. Reggie struggled, his bravado slipping with every step. He had never faced anyone like Ethan before, someone who wasn't intimidated by his reputation, someone who didn't care about the consequences. "Let me go, man," Reggie pleaded, his voice trembling. "You don't know what you're getting into. I've got people." "I don't care." Ethan cut him off, his voice like steel. "You hurt my daughter. That's all I need to know." Reggie's eyes darted around, looking for a way out, but there was none. The alley was deserted. The only sound, the distant hum of the city and the faint thump of the music in the club. Ethan pushed him against a wall, pinning him there with one hand, while the other held his knife. Reggie's fear was now very palpable. He wasn't the invincible gang leader anymore. He was just a man, facing the consequences of his actions. "Look, I didn't mean for things to go that far. I was just messing around. It was a mistake." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "A mistake? You call what you did to my daughter a mistake?" Reggie swallowed hard, realizing too late that there was no talking his way out of this. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but the fury behind his eyes was unmistakable. "I swear, man, I'll leave her alone. I'll never touch her again. Just let me go." Ethan stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing. Every instinct screamed at him to end it, to make Reggie pay for what he had done. But killing him wouldn't bring Lila's peace back. It wouldn't undo the trauma she had suffered. In fact, killing Reggie would upend Lila's world completely. With a father behind bars for murder and nowhere to turn, it would destroy her completely. Instead, Ethan made a different decision. He pulled out his phone and pressed record, holding it up in front of Reggie's face. Confess. Tell the world what you did. Reggie hesitated, glancing at the knife in Ethan's hand. What? Confess. Or I'll make sure you never see the light of day again. Reggie's fear finally broke through. All right, I'll talk. With the phone recording, Reggie began to confess. He admitted to the assault on Lila, detailing the events that led to it. His words were filled with fear and desperation, but they were enough. Ethan listened in silence, his anger simmering beneath the surface. This was justice, but somehow it still didn't feel like enough. When Reggie finished, Ethan stopped the recording and pocketed his phone. He stepped back, still holding the knife, watching as Reggie slumped against the wall, exhausted and terrified. Ethan's mind raced. He could kill Reggie right here, right now, and no one would blame him. But that wasn't the kind of justice Lila needed. She needed to know that her father had stood up for her, but that he hadn't crossed the line. Killing Reggie would only make things worse. Instead, Ethan left Reggie where he was, tied to a lamppost in the alley, his confession recorded. Ethan called his contact at the police station and gave them Reggie's location. Justice is coming for you, Ethan said quietly before walking away, leaving Reggie behind in the dark. Ethan returned home just before dawn, his body aching from the night's events, but his mind clear. The house was silent. The only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake Lila. He paused at her bedroom door, watching her sleep. Her face was peaceful, her chest rising and falling with each breath. For a moment the world seemed calm again. But Ethan knew that the fight wasn't over. Reggie had been caught, but there would be consequences. The gang wouldn't let this slide, and the police might come knocking with questions about how Reggie ended up tied to a lamppost with a broken nose. Ethan didn't care. He would face whatever came next. As he stood there, Lila stirred, her soft movements catching Ethan's attention. She blinked awake, her eyes groggy with sleep. But when they focused on her father standing at the door, concern filled them. Dad? Where were you? Ethan hesitated, his mind scrambling for the right words. He had always been honest with Lila, never hiding the dangers he once faced as a SEAL. But this was different. This was personal, a line crossed that he could never fully explain to her. The anger he had felt, the coldness that had overtaken him when confronting Reggie. It wasn't something he wanted his daughter to understand. I had to take care of something, but it's over now. You're safe. Lila sat up, pulling her knees to her chest. The weight of what had happened to her still clung to her like a shadow, but hearing those words from her father offered some comfort. Is Reggie gone? Ethan nodded, sitting on the edge of her bed. He won't hurt you again. I made sure of that. Lila's lip trembled, and tears welled up in her eyes. I was so scared, Dad. I didn't know what to do. Ethan's heart broke as he listened to her, wishing he could go back in time and protect her from ever having to face that fear. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. I know, sweetheart, and I'm so sorry I wasn't there, but you're safe now. You're strong, Lila. You'll get through this. For a long moment, they sat in silence. The bond between them had always been strong, but after what they'd both endured, it felt deeper. Lila rested her head on her father's shoulder, seeking the quiet reassurance that only he could provide. Ethan kissed the top of her head, closing his eyes as he silently vowed to protect her with everything he had left. Then suddenly the sound of his phone buzzing in his pocket broke the stillness. Ethan frowned, glancing at the screen. It was Tom Carter, the detective and old SEAL buddy who had helped him gather intel on Reggie. Ethan had expected this call sooner or later. I need to take this, Ethan said softly, standing up. Lila nodded, pulling her blanket tighter around herself as he stepped out of the room. He answered the call, his voice low. Yeah? Tom's voice came through, tense, but steady. We've got Reggie, tied up to a lamppost in some alleyway, just like you said. Ethan could picture the scene in his mind. Reggie bruised, terrified, and humiliated. It wasn't justice in the conventional sense, but it was close enough. He give you any trouble? Nah, he's a mess. Confessed to everything. We've got the recording you sent, and it lines up with what he's been telling us. Looks like he'll be behind bars for a long time. You did good, Ethan, but... Tom paused, his tone shifting. The higher-ups are asking questions about how he ended up like that. They know something's off. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had known that leaving Reggie alive would complicate things, but it had been the right decision for Lila's sake. What are they saying? They're suspicious, but nothing solid. As far as Reggie's concerned, he got jumped by some vigilante in the night. He's too scared to say much more, but you need to lay low for a while, brother. This isn't the military. Civilians don't get the same leeway. Ethan exhaled slowly. He had been prepared for this. I get it. Thanks for the heads up, Tom. Look, man, I know why you did what you did, and I don't blame you. Hell, if it were my kid, I'd probably have done worse. But you're walking a fine line here. Just be careful, okay? Lila needs you. Ethan nodded to himself, glancing back at Lila's closed door. She's the only reason I did any of this. I know. Just make sure this doesn't come back to bite you. With that, the call ended, leaving Ethan standing in the dim hallway, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. The mission was over, but the fallout was only beginning. The next few days were uneventful on the surface, but beneath the calm exterior, tension brewed. The local news picked up on Reggie's arrest, painting it as a major win for law enforcement. Headlines hailed the takedown of a dangerous gangster, but no one mentioned the mysterious vigilante who had left him tied up for the police to find. Ethan kept a low profile, staying home with Lila as much as possible. She was slowly starting to return to some semblance of normalcy, though the trauma lingered. She still refused to go back to school, her fear of running into anyone associated with Reggie keeping her confined to the house. Local authorities have arrested a notorious gangster, Reggie, in what is being hailed as a major victory for law enforcement. Sources say he was found tied up in an alleyway, but details remain scarce. The investigation is ongoing. Ethan knew the story was far from over. The fallout would continue, but for now, he focused on what mattered most, keeping Lila safe. Then one evening, as they sat together on the couch watching a movie, Lila turned to her father, her expression serious. "Dad, I know you did something. I know you didn't just let the police handle it." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had tried to shield her from the truth, but Lila was too smart to be fooled. He paused the movie, turning to face her. "Lila, I did what I had to do. I couldn't just stand by and let him get away with what he did to you." She looked down, biting her lip. "I know. I don't want you to get in trouble. I don't want to lose you too." Ethan's chest tightened. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "You won't lose me, Lila, I promise. No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." She nodded, though her eyes were still filled with worry. "I'm scared, Dad. What if his friends come after us? What if they hurt you?" Ethan's protective instincts flared at the thought, but he forced himself to stay calm. "No one's going to hurt us. I've made sure of that. And if they try, they'll have to go through me first." Lila seemed to take some comfort in his words, though the fear in her eyes remained. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I just want things to go back to the way they were." Ethan closed his eyes, wishing the same. But he knew that things would never truly be the same. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the consequences would follow them for a long time. A week later, as Ethan stood in the garage going through his old SEAL gear, the doorbell rang. His pulse quickened, his instincts immediately on high alert. He moved to the front door cautiously, his hand instinctively brushing against the knife clipped to his belt. When he opened the door, he was surprised to find Tom Carter standing there, his expression grim. "Ethan," Tom greeted him, his voice low. "We need to talk." Ethan stepped aside, letting Tom in. "What's going on?" Tom glanced around, making sure they were alone before speaking. "Reggie's gang is making moves. They're not happy about what happened, and word is, they're looking for payback. You and Lila need to be careful." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "Are they coming after us?" "We don't know for sure," Tom admitted, "but I've heard rumors. They know someone took Reggie down, and they're trying to figure out who. It's only a matter of time before they connect the dots." As Tom spoke, Ethan's mind raced. He had expected fallout from Reggie's takedown, but not this quickly. "What are you saying, Tom? Do we need to leave?" Tom hesitated, then nodded. "It might be the safest option, at least until things cool down. I can pull some strings, get you both into protective custody, if it comes to that. But I know that's not what you want." Ethan's jaw tightened. The thought of running, of leaving their home and disappearing, felt wrong. He had spent his life fighting. Running wasn't in his nature. But Lila's safety came first, and if it meant keeping her out of harm's way, he would do whatever it took. "I'll think about it," Ethan said finally. "But if they come after us, I won't be running." Tom sighed, knowing his old friend too well. "Just don't do anything reckless, Ethan. You've already pushed the limits. If this escalates, there's no going back." As Tom left, Ethan stood in the doorway, his mind racing. He had fought too many battles in his life to let fear dictate his actions now. But this wasn't just his fight anymore. Lila's life was at stake, and that changed everything. Ethan closed the door, his resolve hardening. He would protect his daughter at any cost, no matter who came after them. The following day, Ethan and Lila did leave for a couple of days. In fact, they ended up spending 16 days in a motel in Jacksonville, Florida, which ended up turning into a getaway both Ethan and Lila thoroughly enjoyed. When Tom eventually confirmed that Reggie's thugs were unable to figure out who attacked him, Ethan and Lila returned to their home. Nothing ever came from the threats of retaliation, and Reggie ended up being prosecuted for a number of additional crimes, earning him a significant stay in Hancock State Prison. Lila eventually resumed her studies, and over time the assault did become a distant memory. Today, she lives in Panama City, Florida, and has two beautiful sons that both bear an uncanny resemblance to their grandfather, Ethan Cole. Now be honest, if you were in Ethan's shoes, what would you have done? And also, do you think the current justice system allows criminals like Reggie to get away with too much too often? Leave a comment and share your views. Also, it's time to deal with that pesky like button and his friend the subscribe icon again. So if you have not done so already, dish out some punishment. Now, if you enjoyed this story, do yourself a favor and listen to the story on your screen right now. This one will really put a smile of satisfaction on your face when you hear how this retired Marine kicked ass when thugs invaded his neighbor's house. Enjoy. And as always, much love and stay safe.